come back with our guest, Professor Amos Wilson, and the psychology of self-hatred among global African people. Our topic is the psychology of self-hatred among global African people. Our guest, Professor Amos Wilson, Professor of Psychology at the New York Institute of Technology and also at the College of New Rochelle. He's also author of the book, The Developmental Psychology of the Black Child. Professor Wilson, we had a guest who, or rather a caller just a few moments ago who raised an area with Skinner, I do believe.
Very, very important area, because the topic of what we call Skinnerian conditioning, instrumental conditioning, is a standard topic raised in psychology. The essence of Skinnerian conditioning, or sometimes SR psychology, particularly of Skinner's type, named after B.F. Skinner, Harvard professor, who didn't so much discover new principles as just codify ways of behaving and consequences that already existed. The essence of it is that behavior is controlled by its consequences. Okay. That behavior that brings good consequences tends to be repeated and increased in frequency and probability of occurrence. Behavior that's followed by negative consequences tend to be decreased or eliminated. And a very simple but very powerful principle, and that's really the essence of it. And conditioning involves, to a good extent, you see, manipulating reward and punishment in order to bring about particular changes in behavior, you see. And so it's a very, very important psychology that many black students are educated in and don't understand at all.
What's the twist on it in terms of self-hatred?
The twist is the essence of power. You see, at first, this psychology is often presented in terms of a rat. Okay? You put a rat in a box or in some condition, and if it behaves in a certain way, you give it something to eat, you give it something to drink. Okay? That's a reward. If it behaves in a way you don't want it to behave, you give it an electric shock, punish it, or don't give it food. So, of course, because it wants to eat, and of course you make sure you've starved it before you put it in to the system. So if it wants to eat and so forth, it eventually learns the relationship between certain behavior and certain consequences. So if by standing up on its two hind feet it gets fed, it will stand up on its two hind feet much more frequently than before the system was put into order, you see. So the rat is conditioned by living under those circumstances. The experimenter who has control of the rat, you see, can create certain behaviors or reinforce certain behaviors in the rat by determining which behaviors will be rewarded and which will be punished. Now, where black students are miseducated in these psychology classes is that often the lesson is left right there. Okay, and I use this experiment, as a matter of fact, to get people to understand the difference between equal education and a relevant education, of how a black student can be equally educated with a white student. They just learn the same thing and be made dumb by the same learning. Now, a black student and a white student can learn that principle in the same way, but it doesn't have the same effects. Because you can look at this relationship between the experimenter and this rat as a power relationship, as a political relationship, you see, which says this experimenter who has control of the rewards and punishments of this rat is able to create behavior in this rat as a result of having that power. You see, being that he has control over the rewards and punishment, he uses that control to condition the rat. And then when I move on from there, I ask my students then, who has control of the water that comes into your neighborhood? Who has control of the food, the control of the jobs, controls of the symbols of status, control of information, and we go on and on. Can't you see that you are the rat? You see, this is where you end when you're talking to black students. You don't end with the rat and the experimenter.
Right.
You see, and a black student who has not been taught that, and who has not been taken to have that experiment moved out of its standard presentation into politics and into the reality of his life is miseducated, even though he's learning the same thing that the white student learned, you see. And this is why I try to get across to the people. You must understand, having our people learn the same thing a white student learned is not going to get you out of your condition. Now then, you have to look up on then, if you look up on the Harlems, the Bed-Stuys, even whole nations where blacks live in the world today, they are boxes. And we are rats in them. And when you see the IMF and the United States banks and the other European countries manipulating reward and punishment, selling weapons and creating wars and doing all of these kinds of things, you have in principle the same thing, you see. And just as that rat's behavior is being created by the manipulation of reward and punishment, the behavior and attitudes of black people are being created by the control of Europeans of rewards and punishment. This is the essence of power. The essence of power is the ability to selectively reward and punish what you want. Now, how does this relate to self-hatred? I hate to hold your people up, but I just want to, because this is a vital topic in psychology, and black students should deal with this topic very thoroughly because there's deep implication. When this is talked about, often the black student identifies himself with the experimenter, and the experimenter is a white man. And it's when you identify with him because he's a human being, and the other thing is a rat. But when you identify with that experimenter, you're misidentifying yourself. You see, when the white student identifies himself with the experimenter, his identity is closer to reality, you see. And so in learning the same thing, his racial position is reinforced, even though it appears that he's getting the same education, you see. And people must learn the difference between so-called equal education. Getting equal education for black students is not getting them to learn the same thing white students are learning. And we're going to have to understand this. So then just as that conditioning situation presented by Skinner is what we call a rat in the box, the nations where our people's lives are controlled through the manipulation of Europeans is what we can call a nigger box. It is where Africans are created into niggers as a result of the manipulation of reward and punishment by Europeans. We have to keep that in mind. How do you create self-hatred then? Certain of that rat's behavior is associated with reward, with pleasure, with good feelings, with security, with love, if you want to call it that, you see. So whenever he performs that, he moves toward that behavior, and he emits that behavior because it brings those rewards. Or he emits that behavior because it helps him to escape from pain, from hunger, from fear, from insecurity. You see, and that's another method used in these Skinner boxes, you see, where if we don't reward the animal, we permit him to escape pain. Okay, now then, let's... All right, now, just one other thing.
I saw echoes of slavery in my mind on that.
Definitely.
One. Yeah,
and this is going to go back now to drug behavior and everything else we'll get to, later on. Now, self-hatred, and this goes back to the first statement I made as one of the first methods that's used to breed self-hatred. Remember, the association of innate and personal and group characteristics with negative feelings and so forth. So then, how do you create self-hatred? You make everything that you innately are negative and painful. So that being black is made to be painful. Being African is made to be painful, you see. Identifying yourself as an African means you don't get rewarded. It means you go hungry. It means you don't get accepted, you see. And so by stacking all of these negatives onto African characteristics, it motivates the African to escape his characteristics and seek relief through that escape.
There's something that came up that is just such a graphic illustration of what you're saying in an advertising campaign that never made Madison Avenue. A friend of mine was involved in this, and I don't know what the final rejection was based on, but this was in the 60s, and it was for an aspirin, and it said it was going to be positioned in the subways as, this is what you need for the black ache.
Yeah.
So, and I mean, it was like, when the whole deal and the whole experience of being black is just too much, take this for the black ache.
And believe me, we move toward pain relievers, which is, of course, why you look at the drugs, and these fundamentally are pain relievers. But let's not only talk about drugs. We're going to talk later on about sexual addictions, love, what we call love in our community, and other kinds of behaviors that are relievers of pain. One other statement, because the caller here mentioned something very, very, very rich and fundamental. This self-hatred also is related to this Skinner paradigm. You see, this is how you take knowledge in books and you Africanize it by seeing how it applies and can be used to your own interest.
Yes.
You see, and so, but I'll speak about that later on. I just want to, you got to.
But let's get to the calls.
One more.
Go ahead, one more.
Because this relates.
These people are going to kill me now.
Yes,
go ahead.
But this relates to the second principle I wanted to mention that produces self-hatred, and that is to actually create the negative characteristics in the individual group via what I call the self-fulfilling vicious cycle, created incompetences and the creations of subcultures, but through the use of this Skinnerian conditioning, create the actual characteristics that you will come to hate later on, and that the individual will come to hate in and of himself. So in other words, the black man, as we see him today, is a created person.
Okay.
And he's
an environmentally created person.
Yes, he is conditioned. You see, one of the reasons why you want to remove European power is that you want by removing that power, you also remove his ability to create you. And by gaining that power yourself, you move into the ability to be self-creating.
WLIB, I'm Gary Bird. You're on the air with Professor Amos Wilson.